The shot that was meant to silence President Ibrahim Traore forever never came. Not because the assassin hesitated or faltered, but because, against all the logic of the most sophisticated military training, meticulous infiltration, and international planning spanning continents, and the interests of silent powers, Ibrahim Traore already knew that at that precise moment, with the sky over Ouagadougou still painted in soft hues of dawn, the fresh grass of the presidential garden would be the stage for the greatest confrontation of his life. As he knelt serenely on the dewy lawn, hands clasped in silent prayer, there were no soldiers around him, no electronic eyes or vigilant sentinels, only the distant murmur of birds and the scent of flowers swaying gently in the morning breeze, as if nature, oblivious to human drama, insisted on maintaining its unperturbed cycle. Yet behind him, with the coldness only men shaped by the machinery of war can possess, Daniel Kane, the American spy, concealed under the perfect guise of a gardener, dressed in simple, dirt-stained clothes, was preparing to pull the trigger of his silenced pistol, the same weapon he carried as both a symbol and instrument of years of clandestine operations, always in the name of interests that never reveal themselves to those sacrificed for them. But before the slight movement of his finger could release the lethal charge that would abruptly end one of the boldest political revolutions of the century, Ibrahim Traore's calm and deep voice cut through the air like a fine blade, uttering a phrase that would be etched forever in the agent's memory. "You've traveled a long way to die here, haven't you?" Daniel froze, as if the words had a tangible weight that paralyzed him, and in that exact moment, like a beast awakened, Traore spun his body with an agility unexpected of a man accustomed to presidential protocols, delivering a precise strike that dislodged the weapon from the spy's hand, sending it flying, while simultaneously pinning him down with brutal force, pressing his chest against the earth and twisting his arms with a technique honed only through years of intense training in elite military schools, exactly as Traore had done during his time in Russia, Cuba, and the arid fields of the Sahel, where war is learned not as a theory, but as a vital necessity. The shock was not only physical but psychological, for Daniel, accustomed to being the predator, was now the prey, crushed against the African soil he had sought to violate with his cold, calculated mission. When the palace guards, alerted by hidden sensors installed by the president himself, burst into the garden, they found a scene they would never forget. The head of state, kneeling over the body of a man who had been invisible until then, his eyes burning not with hatred, but with a rare lucidity, speaking with the calm of someone who had anticipated everything. "No one shoots. He's not just an assassin, he's a message, and I want to hear it straight from his mouth." Dragged like a trophy or a symbol into the depths of the secret bunker beneath the palace, Daniel was handcuffed to a steel chair in the center of a damp, dark room, where the stone walls held, like silent tombs, confessions that power would never allow to be known. Minutes later, Ibrahim Traore entered alone without escorts or visible weapons, carrying only a steaming cup of tea, its faint vapor seeming to mock the inner chill of the agent, and sat across from him with the tranquility of someone who, even after escaping death, remained the absolute master of every second. "Where are you from?" the president asked, his voice sounding like an irresistible invitation but also an inevitable sentence, as he slowly placed the cup on the metal table, never breaking eye contact. Daniel raised his icy eyes, with the pride typical of those molded by the clandestinity and brutal pragmatism of intelligence operations, and replied curtly, "You already know." But Traore, with the same serenity, pressed, "Say it anyway. Say it for the record." And then, with a resigned smile blending sarcasm and defeat, Daniel said, "Langley, I work for the agency. I was sent here under orders from Washington, but the plan came from Abidjan. Signed personally by Alassane Ouattara." The silence that followed was so dense it seemed the walls themselves were breathing, as Ibrahim Traore, showing no surprise, merely tilted his head slightly, as if confirming a long-held hypothesis. But Daniel had more to say, and with a voice laced with the perfidious superiority of those who believe they control the world's hidden gears, he continued, "You're disrupting the region's balance. You toppled French dominance, welcomed the Russians, spread the idea that Africa can be free without Western tutelage. You're becoming a legend, a symbol. And symbols, Mr. President, cannot be left free for long." Ibrahim Traore then stood slowly, as if allowing gravity to manifest without haste, and glanced briefly at the closed door before turning his eyes back to the handcuffed man before him. But before he could utter a word, Daniel, in a final attempt to reassert his presence, leaned forward and delivered the most disturbing revelation. "And I'm not the only one. Look around you, Ibrahim. You're surrounded by smiles, but half of them have already been bought. Someone inside your palace gave me the gate code, and guess what? Tonight they'll meet to plan the second attempt." The president remained motionless, like a millennial statue unmoved by tempests, but deep within his mind was already processing, with the precision of someone who had learned to trust not even his own shadow, that the spy's words were more than a provocation. They were a warning, an unmistakable sign that the conspiracy was not an isolated episode, but a web entwined into the very foundations of the power he believed he controlled. Thus, after a few seconds that felt eternal, he replied, with the same serenity with which he had faced the gun at his neck, "Then I suppose I need to attend that meeting in person." And that night, as the palace lights remained on and the guards held their posts as if nothing had happened, a silent war was waged in the bowels of the presidential residence, for Ibrahim Traore, dressed in a common soldier's uniform, his face concealed by a scarf, moved through the corridors with the familiarity of someone who knew every corner of that labyrinth of power, accompanied only by 2 of his Red Lions, his elite force loyal to the end, and by his intelligence chief, the only man he still believed at that moment to be worthy of his trust. At exactly 11:37 p.m., in the same underground room where days earlier supplies had been stored, now transformed into the epicenter of betrayal, 7 men gathered, 2 soldiers, a political advisor, the palace doctor, and 3 officers with strategic positions. On the table, a tablet displayed the message that initiated what they believed to be the final blow. Ivory Flame Plan, Phase 2, Support Team in Position. And as always happens when mediocre men delude themselves with power, one of them, gripped by anxiety, asked, "What if Traore finds out?" The doctor, with the coldness of someone who had traded the oath to save lives for the sordidness of betrayal, replied without hesitation, "He won't. He must be dead by now. The poison is already circulating." They all nodded, blinded by confidence in the meticulously crafted plan, backed and funded by interests they would never personally know, but which moved the pieces from afar. Yet none of them noticed that, behind the wall, hidden in the darkness, Ibrahim Traore was listening to every word, with the same self-control he had displayed hours earlier when he subdued the man sent to kill him. And then, like a shadow emerging to claim its presence, Traore pushed open the door, stepped into the room, and with a calm, cutting voice, announced, "You speak like men, but you scheme like rats." That phrase, uttered with the serenity of someone who fears neither death nor betrayal, froze those present more than any gunshot could have. Their gazes turned simultaneously, breaths held, and even the most trained among them felt cold sweat trickle down their temples, for there was no room for doubt. Before them stood Ibrahim Traore, the man they believed seconds ago to be dead, or at least debilitated by the poison which, ironically, he had never consumed, for suspicious of the strange movements around him, he had avoided all ceremonial toasts in recent weeks, drinking only tea prepared by his own hands, a suspicion that, at that moment, proved not only prudent but vital. The first to react impulsively was one of the officers, who, in a desperate move, drew his weapon and raised it toward the president, but before he could even adjust his aim, Traore, with the speed and precision that defined him, lunged and in a single motion twisted the traitor's wrist, making the gun fall with a dull thud onto the cement floor. The second movement, as swift as the first, was the entry of the Red Lions who, like trained predators, burst through the door, subduing each one without fanfare or hesitation until all 7 conspirators were restrained, their bodies pressed against the ground, their eyes wide not only with fear of imminent punishment, but above all with the incomprehension of how the man they thought they had defeated now stood as the silent executor of justice. Traore remained standing, breathing calmly as he observed those who until days before had smiled at his meetings, toasted at official celebrations, and signed with steady hands documents sealing agreements and strategies for the country's future, but who in the shadows plotted his downfall and, more than that, the destruction of the sovereignty he fought to establish. breaking the centuries-old chains that kept Burkina Faso bound to neo-colonial interests. As the Red Lions began to remove the conspirators, one by one to be interrogated in the palace's most secure facilities, the doctor, the same man entrusted with the president's health, dared to whisper something, not as a plea for mercy, but as the desperate last play of someone who knows their life hangs on the edge of the abyss. "You stopped the spy, but not the snake." Traore leaned slightly, his expression unchanged, and asked in a deep voice, laden not with threat but with icy curiosity. "Who?" The doctor, with a faint, trembling smile, replied, "He's closer than you think, and he's already moving." The words, spoken with the coldness of someone who knows they've planted a seed of doubt in the heart of the region's most powerful man, lingered in the air like an invisible poison, and though Traore maintained his serene posture, inwardly his mind was already operating with the precision of someone who understood that the game he faced was no longer just one of strength or military strategy, but a psychological war where trust was the rarest and most dangerous currency. At dawn, as the first rays of sun painted Ouagadougou's sky golden, Traore sat at his desk, contemplating 7 photographs laid out before him. Familiar faces, men who served in his government, soldiers who had sworn loyalty, but who were now revealed as traitors. Yet one face was missing, the central piece of that puzzle of betrayal still hidden. "He's still out there. Someone very close, someone I trust," Traore murmured to his intelligence chief, who, with a discreet nod, confirmed what could no longer be denied. There was a serpent hidden within the innermost structure of power. As he processed the multiple layers of betrayal surrounding him, a message arrived through official diplomatic channels. From the U.S. Embassy, a formal communication stating, "Washington regrets the misunderstanding. The agent acted without authorization. We request a private meeting to avoid escalation." Traore read the message carefully, but something in its construction, the excessive coldness of the language, and the cryptographic origin felt off. He turned to his cybersecurity chief and asked with the same firmness of someone demanding not just answers but certainties, "Is this real?" The officer hesitated, quickly analyzed the message's metadata, and then, with a look blending disbelief and fear, replied, "The channel? Yes. But the location of the transmission? It wasn't from America." Traore, with the calm of someone who already anticipates the answer, asked, "Where from?" The officer, after a second that felt like an eternity, replied, "Private network, within Ivory Coast." Then Traore stood, looked at the map of West Africa pinned to his office wall, and, without raising his voice, simply said, "Then it begins." Meanwhile, in a different wing of the presidential palace, far from cameras and guarded corridors, another man moved with the confidence and authority only high-ranking generals possess. His name, General Yakuba Dio, a man who had served under 3 presidents, trained half the soldiers in the capital, and whom Ibrahim Traore had, on countless occasions, publicly presented as the pillar of our defense. He walked the corridors as if at home, greeting each guard, each staff member with calculated smiles, knowing no one would dare stop him, for his position, built over decades, was unassailable. At exactly 10:15 that morning, General Dio entered a locked room near the palace's communications center, a room that, at first glance, seemed a mere storage for medical equipment, but which, hidden under a box marked with the Red Cross symbol, concealed an ASMOL satellite communication device, highly encrypted, through which he sent a brief but definitive message to Abidjan: "All targets exposed. Only Traore remains, awaiting green light." After pressing the send button, he awaited confirmation, but instead of the usual signal, the device emitted a strange beep. A red light pulsed, and immediately after, a voice echoed through the hidden speaker. "You're sending too late, General. He already knows." General Dio's blood ran cold, his face drained of color, and instinctively he turned toward the door, where, standing with the tranquility of someone who fears no confrontation, was Ibrahim Traore. The president, hands clasped behind his back, stared at him with that expression his enemies had already learned to fear, a blend of disappointment and unwavering determination. "We found your device days ago, General. We monitored your messages. We heard your false loyalties. Even the Americans underestimated how far you'd go." Dio, in a final desperate impulse, reached for his holster, but before he could even touch the weapon, one of the room's windows shattered with the entry of a Red Lion who, in a lightning-fast move, pinned the general against the wall, immobilizing him with the force that only absolute loyalty can grant. Traore approached slowly, stopping just inches from the face of the man he had, until days before called a brother-in-arms, and asked, without altering his tone, "How much did they pay you to betray this land?" General Dio, with a final smile blending resignation and disdain, replied, "It wasn't money, that it was fear. They said if I didn't help, Burkina Faso would burn." Traore, staring into his eyes with the intensity of someone who understands not only the betrayal, but the invisible forces that motivated it, responded, "Then let them come with fire. We will answer with thunder." As Dio was dragged through the palace corridors under the watchful eyes of the Red Lions, Traore turned to his trusted officers and, without hesitation, ordered, "Prepare the airbase, we're heading to the border." Hours later, with the sun dominating the Sahel sky, President Ibrahim Traore entered without fanfare a black SUV, devoid of flags or the traditional presidential convoy, accompanied only by 4 of his most loyal Red Lions, all dressed in civilian clothes, blending into the environment like any ordinary traveler. His destination, the border between Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast, not to declare war, but to deliver a warning that would resonate far beyond geographical lines. Traore had received confirmation that the orders to eliminate him had not only come from the Ivorian military command, but were backed by the silent support of foreign interests, invisible hands, that for decades had shaped the destinies of African nations for their own convenience. Thus he decided to do the unthinkable, go to them, look into the eyes of those who ordered his death, and without intermediaries declare that he would not yield. 3 hours later, the black SUV slowed as it approached an old abandoned customs station, a place that in times past had been a symbol of colonial bureaucracies and now, ironically, served as the stage for the meeting between the man who defied empires and the general who represented them. Ahead, waiting with 2 armored vehicles and a discreet escort, was General Kawasi, one of the highest-ranking officers in the Ivorian army and a trusted confidant of President Alassane Ouattara, whose expression, upon seeing Ibrahim Traore calmly step out of the SUV, showed neither surprise nor discomfort, only the protocolic coldness of someone who follows orders without indulging in the luxury of useless emotions. "This is not your land, President," Kawasi said in a sharp, dry voice, like a honed blade that doesn't cut immediately, but wounds through anticipation, and then added, placing a brown folder on the old wooden table, "You come here unannounced. This could be considered a threat." Traore approached the table slowly, never breaking eye contact, and with a firm motion opened the folder, revealing satellite images of an Ivorian training camp, intercepted communications from the spy Daniel Kane, records of mercenary flights from Seagal, all meticulously organized like pieces of a puzzle that, once assembled, left no doubt about the transnational conspiracy woven against him. Kawasi leafed through the documents with the cynical indifference typical of those who live among shadows and clandestine operations, until, after a brief pause, he let out a muffled laugh and said, "You have no idea what's really going on, do you?" Traore, his expression unwavering, stared directly at the general and replied, "Then explain." The general leaned slightly over the table, as if drawing closer not to attack but to share an ancient, indisputable secret, and said, "Ouattara isn't the only one involved. It's not just about you. It's about the new map being drawn in West Africa. Your revolution, by removing French dominance and rejecting ECOWAS, is drawing too much attention. It's scared a lot of people. They don't want to kill you just because you're dangerous. They want to kill you because you're inspiring others." Traore remained still, absorbing each word as if deciphering a dark prophecy long foretold, and then with the same serenity replied, "So, it's about fear." "No," Kawasi retorted, with the hardness of someone who has made this analysis many times before. "It's about control." But before the conversation could continue, the general leaned closer and in an almost conspiratorial tone concluded, "Do you know where Daniel Kane is right now, President?" Traore nodded slightly, responding, "In a bunker, being interrogated." But Kawasi shook his head, with that half-smile that conveys not joy but superiority. "No, he escaped last night, with help from within your own government. Back in Ouagadougou, as silent alarms sounded in the security sectors, the terrible news was confirmed. Daniel Kane, the American spy captured days earlier, had mysteriously vanished. 2 guards found drugged in the basement. Security cameras cut for exactly 6 minutes. No witnesses, no recordings, no electronic trace. It was as if he had evaporated into thin air. But for Ibrahim Traore, that disappearance could only mean one thing. He was still in the country, and someone very close, someone with unrestricted access, was hiding him. Traore didn't shout, didn't call emergency meetings or expose himself to the risk of blindly trusting anyone. Instead, with the strategic coldness of someone who understood he was playing not chess but a game of survival, he activated Operation Tinger, a secret sweep conducted exclusively by a small, highly select group of Red Lions loyal only to him, tasked with wiretapping, surveilling and infiltrating the routines of every high-ranking government official, without exception. For 3 silent, meticulously calculated nights, the agents observed ministers, monitored calls, intercepted messages, and listened to whispered conversations in corridors where power, once secure, now trembled under suspicion. And then, finally, a pattern emerged, a name that surfaced with disturbing frequency in obscure interactions. The Minister of Defense, Colonel Hamidou Sangaré, a man Traoré not only deeply respected but had personally promoted after victories in the Sahel battles, someone considered not just a colleague but a brother in arms. On the 4th night, as the city slept under its usual apparent tranquility, one of the Red Lion agents discreetly followed Sangaré's car, which, instead of heading to his home or the defense headquarters, took a winding route to the outskirts of the city, parking in front of an abandoned colonial mansion, shrouded in shadows and silence, with broken windows and doors that, despite their decayed appearance, hid more than ruins. The agent, strategically positioned, observed through a crack in the rotting wood a scene that chilled his blood. There, calmly seated, sipping tea, was Daniel Kane, without the beard he had worn as a disguise, but still with the same wrist tracker, irrefutable proof he had never left the country, and across from him, sitting with the same ease of someone who fears no discovery, was Colonel Sangaré himself. The information reached President Traoré at 2:04 a.m. He showed no surprise, nor did he let any emotion surface. He simply rose from his chair, looked fixedly at the agent delivering the report, and said, with the calm that had become his hallmark, "We move in 3 hours. No shots, unless I give the order." At 2:57 a.m., 3 unmarked vehicles silently surrounded the old mansion. Traoré himself led the entry team, moving through the dusty corridors with the precision of someone who had long overcome the naivety of blindly trusting even those closest to him. They breached through the back door, flashlights off, steps calculated, until in the living room Daniel Kane, in the exact moment he reached for his phone, was startled by the sudden light cutting through the darkness. The spy froze, eyes wide, but on the other side of the room, standing firm with a pistol aimed directly at his head, was Ibrahim Traore. "Didn't think I'd find you so quickly, did you?" the president said, with that half-smile that conveyed not arrogance, but the certainty of someone who once again was one step ahead. Daniel didn't respond, only glanced toward Sangaré, who was already handcuffed and under the custody of 2 Red Lions. The minister didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't seek justifications. He merely looked at Traoré and whispered with a mix of resignation and bitterness, "They promised peace." Traoré approached slowly, lowering his weapon and facing the man he had considered a pillar of his defense, and replied, "Peace doesn't come from betrayal. You gave them our coordinates. You let them in. You nearly sold this country for a handshake." Finally, Daniel Kane broke his silence, with that calculatedly provocative tone characteristic of him. "You're clever, Traoré, but this won't end with me. There are others, outside and inside. You think you're in control, but you're only delaying what's already coming." Traoré then stepped closer until his eyes were inches from Kane's and replied, "Then I'll delay it with fire and bury it before it touches our soil." As Kane and Sangaré were taken into maximum custody, one final item was found hidden in a folder under the table, a printed map detailing the locations of military bases in Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, and Ghana, with red markers on gold mines, telecommunications towers, and media stations, along with a discreet but unmistakable logo of an American private security company, and at the top of the document, a phrase that sealed the true magnitude of what was unfolding: Phase 3, Regional Stabilization. Traore stared at the map for long seconds, then raised his eyes and with a voice heavy with a lucidity that no longer allowed for illusions, said, "This was never just about me. This is about the entire region. They want to redraw Africa." That same night, Traore urgently convened a secret meeting with the military leaders of Mali and Niger. For the first time in years, the three countries stood united as a single force. Before a large screen displaying the seized map, Traore spoke with the conviction of someone who, even under imminent threat, understood the true scope of the danger. "We face the same enemy. They come with money and sweet words, but behind them are weapons, spies and chains, and today we end the silence." And so on that night, when Ouagadougou's sky remained opaque and heavy, heralding not the arrival of peace but the outbreak of a new phase of resistance, President Ibrahim Traore, before his allies, launched Operation Dignity, a joint, secret mission to apprehend foreign spies, freeze hidden bank accounts, and expose the private military networks that, in the shadows, operated to subjugate West Africa. But before departing, he went to the cell where Daniel Kane, now stripped of arrogance and smiles, sat in silence, awaiting him. Traore raised the dossier, filled with irrefutable evidence linking Kane to a series of failed coups in Liberia, Guinea, Chad and beyond, and with a firm voice declared, "You came to break a country, but you ended up making it stronger. Now go and tell them, we are awake and we are no longer afraid." And as his words echoed not only through the palace walls but across West Africa, on the other side of the world, in a silent office, a man in a dark suit hung up the phone after hearing, "He got through. Cancel the operation. We'll find another way." But for Ibrahim Traore at that moment it mattered little. He already knew that the true battle was not against the enemies hiding in the shadows, but against the shadow within each enemy.